The episode opens with a title card saying, England, 14th century. A narrator informs us about witch burnings in medieval times and how they were completely pointless, and explains that on the rare occasion that they actually caught a real witch or wizard, the witch or wizard in question would simply perform a flame freezing charm when they tried to burn them. They would then pretend to scream in pain whilst enjoying a gentle tickling sensation. As the narrator speaks, we see a group of men charge into a woman's house. They grab her, pull her out, tie her to a pole, and then light a fire beneath her. The narrator identifies her as Wendelin the Weird, informing us that she enjoyed being burnt so much that she allowed herself to be caught no fewer than 47 times in various disguises. We then cut to Harry in bed, reading a history of magic under the duvet and scribbling down notes on parchment. I think this is a really interesting way to start this season, as witch burnings are pretty horrific, so it does really highlight how this season will be slightly darker than the last. We then see Harry get out of bed and go to the window, where he then sees 3 owls flying towards him, one being carried by 2 others. Each owl was carrying a package, and we watch Harry open each in turn, seeing that they are letters and birthday presents. And as Harry reads each letter, I think it would be nice to have the characters who wrote the letters narrating what Harry is reading. The first letter is from Ron, who tells Harry that he is in Egypt with his family after Mr. Weasley won the Daily Prophet Grand Draw. As we listen to Ron's letter, Harry unfurls a newspaper and sees the Weasleys all standing outside a pyramid. This will be very important later on. Ron also goes on to apologise for a phone call that he made to Harry earlier in the holidays. I absolutely love this moment in the book, and it was pretty difficult to know how to fit it into this episode, as Harry is simply remembering what happened instead of it happening in real time. I try not to be too over-reliant on flashbacks, however I do think that it is the safest route here. Basically, when Ron mentions the phone call, we'll see a flashback of the moment where Ron and Uncle Vernon essentially have a shouting match over the telephone. It's just way too hilarious to miss out. Harry then sees Ron's present, a sneaker scope. He reads Hermione's letter and sees her present, which is a broomstick servicing kit. And he finally reads Hagrid's letter and sees his present, which is the Monster Book of Monsters. Harry then notices one more letter, and this time it's from Hogwarts, and as he reads, we hear one more piece of narration, this time from Professor McGonagall.
Third years are permitted to visit the village of Hogsmeade at certain weekends. Please give the enclosed permission form to your parent or guardian to sign.
Harry looks glumly down at the permission slip, knowing it will be next to impossible to convince Uncle Vernon to sign it. We then hear Uncle Vernon's voice boom up the stairs, and we follow Harry as he heads down and finds the Dursleys eating breakfast and watching TV. On the TV is a news report about an escaped convict, warning everyone to be on high alert in case they see him and providing a hotline number. This is just a small detail that the movie left out, but I really like how it ties the story together once again, especially as we find out a little bit more about this in a later season during the Other Minister chapter from Half-Blood Prince. Uncle Vernon then goes on to tell Harry that Aunt Marge will be visiting for a week, and I especially want to include the moment where Uncle Vernon tells Harry,
"We've told Marge you attend St. Brutus's Secure Centre for Incurably Criminal Boys,"
at which Harry screams his outrage. I think it's really important to show how much bolder Harry is getting around the Dursleys, and how he isn't afraid to be defiant in accepting who he is. Harry then goes on to essentially blackmail Uncle Vernon into signing the form if he behaves himself, and after Uncle Vernon agrees, we hear a knock at the door, and Aunt Marge arrives. In the book, Uncle Vernon goes to the train station to get Marge, but this is just a minor detail that I have changed, and there will be quite a few moments like this in the season as a whole in order to condense things down to allow time for more important moments. The arrival of Aunt Marge will then be very similar to the movie, with her smothering Dudley with attention and throwing shady looks and insults at Harry. We then move into a montage of Marge's visit. As in the book, it describes describes how each day presented its own challenges, with Aunt Marge essentially testing Harry and him developing techniques such as visioning his broomstick servicing kit to stay calm. We see clips of them at different dinners, with Aunt Marge throwing insults at Harry, and we see a clip of them at a shopping centre with Aunt Marge buying Dudley huge presents and staring at Harry as if daring him to complain. The montage then ends with the final dinner of the week, and the rest of this scene will be very similar to the movie, with Aunt Marge getting overly drunk, going completely over the top with insulting Harry and his family before Harry loses control and blows her up like a balloon. The only real difference of this scene will be that Aunt Marge doesn't fly outside and into the sky like she does in the movie. Instead, she simply bounces around the living room ceiling with the Dursleys trying to pull her down. Again, like in the movie, Harry then heads upstairs, grabs his trunk and Hedwig's cage before heading downstairs, telling Uncle Vernon he's leaving and stepping out into the night. We cut to black to end sequence 1. Sequence 2 is a slightly shorter but very action-packed one. It will also be very similar to the movie as it will cover the night bus scene. Like in the movie, we follow Harry as he walks into the night before seeing a large black dog skulking in an alley. As Harry steps backwards, he trips over his trunk, throws his arm in the air before a giant purple triple-decker bus appears out of nowhere. The main difference of the night bus scene from the movie will be that this is more fleshed out, as the movie scene only lasted for about 5 to 6 minutes, and here I think we can allow about 10 to 15 minutes. Essentially, we see a lot more details about the night bus trip, such as Harry ordering hot chocolate and Stan promptly spilling it all over his pillow, the night bus stopping numerous times to let off nauseous witches and wizards, and a more expanded conversation between Harry, Stan, and Ernie the bus driver. Stan explains more about the night bus lore, and they have a much deeper conversation about Sirius Black, Azkaban, and the Azkaban guards. And one more point about the night bus, I think that the movies absolutely nailed the appearance of it, so I really don't think that they need to do much here in order to change that. I think once again, as I've mentioned before, the main difference will be the interior, with it basically just being more expanded and detailed. I'd almost want it to be like a TARDIS, much bigger on the inside than on the outside. Eventually, the night bus rolls up to the leaky cauldron. Harry steps out and, to his horror, sees Cornelius Fudge standing there with his hands on his hips and a stern look on his face. Harry freezes in shock, and we cut to black to end sequence 2. Once again, this is a pretty short sequence, but as it's so action-packed, I think it's fine, and it's also a perfect way to end sequence 2 on a mini cliffhanger. Sequence 3 opens up with Harry and Fudge in a private parlour, and the conversation between them is very similar to the movie again, with Fudge telling Harry that he's not in trouble for the incident with Aunt Marge, and that they're just relieved to have found Harry. The only real addition will be that at the end of the conversation, Harry will ask Fudge if he could sign the Hogsmeade permission slip, to which Fudge refuses. We then follow Harry out of the parlour and to a bedroom reserved for him, where we see Hedwig hooting happily in the corner. The rest of sequence 3 then covers a portion of one of my absolute favourite chapters from any Harry Potter book, Harry's Wonderful Week in Diagon Alley. This really is the first time where we spend an extended period of time in the adult wizarding world. Obviously, Harry has been to Diagon Alley before, but they were on very brief visits, and this time we'll truly get to explore many of the different nooks and crannies of Diagon Alley. Firstly, we would see Harry's time in Diagon Alley through a montage. Sorry for people who aren't a fan of montages, as it's really the only convenient way to cover Harry's time here without it covering an entire episode. We will see Harry in the leaky cauldron eating breakfast and watching all of the many different odd characters. We'll see him eating ice cream outside Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlour, my dream by the way, and we'd see him window shopping, looking at solid gold gobstones, a moving model of the galaxy in a glass orb, and of course, the firebolt. I'd also want to see the moment where Harry goes to get his school books and the incident with the shopkeeper being infuriated by the Monster Book of Monsters, and his relief when Harry says he already has one. This has to be included purely for the moment where the shopkeeper says,
I thought we'd seen the worst when we bought 200 copies of The Invisible Book of Invisibility. Cost a fortune, and we never found them.
Again, this whole sequence is just so important to me, as it really is the first time that we can see the wizarding world enriched in a way never seen before. The montage ends with Harry once again outside the ice cream parlor when he hears a voice scream his name, and Ron and Hermione appear. We'll then follow the trio as they head to the magical menagerie to get a rat tonic for Scabbers as he's been looking very ill. Yet another breadcrumb. And whilst they're in the shop, a giant ginger cat leaps down onto Ron's head and then streaks out of the shop chasing Scabbers. Harry and Ron then rush out to find Scabbers, and when they come back, they see that Hermione has bought the cat called Crookshanks. And I really want the Crookshanks and Scabbers subplot to play an integral part of this season, as I know the movies did include it, but nowhere near as much as the book did. We then move towards the climax of the episode, with the trio heading back to the Leaky Cauldron, where they find all of the Weasley family waiting there, ready for a big reunion dinner. We get a quick reintroduction to all of the Weasley siblings.
Harry, simply splendid to see you, old boy. Marvellous! Absolutely spiffing.
And Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. We then see a brief clip of the whole gang enjoying their dinner before we cut to Harry in his room packing his trunk as they will head to Hogwarts the next day. Harry then hears raised voices coming from the room next door, and when he goes to investigate, he finds Percy and Ron in a shouting match. Percy is accusing Ron of stealing his head boy badge, and Ron is saying that he can't find Scabbers' rat tonic and that he thinks it's down at the bar. Harry says to Ron that he'll go and find it, and on his way, he overhears another argument, this time coming from Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's room. Harry pauses to slyly listen to the argument, and as Harry listens, it gets more and more heated before he hears Mr. Weasley say that he wants to warn Harry that Sirius Black has escaped from Azkaban to find Harry and to kill him. We focus on Harry as he stands in the dimly lit hallway in shock before we cut to black and the credits roll on episode 1. Episode 2 opens with a wide shot of platform 9 3/4, the day after the climax from the previous episode. As the Weasleys load their trunks onto the train, Mr. Weasley pulls Harry aside and goes to warn him about Sirius Black trying to find him and kill him. But before Arthur can finish, Harry interrupts him and says that he already knows. I love this small change from the movie as it shows a more caring side of Harry. He's protective of Mr. Weasley here and doesn't want him to risk his position at the Ministry by saying too much. The camera then follows the trio as they get on the train and head down it trying to look for an empty compartment when they finally find one with a man sleeping inside it, Professor Lupin. As they sit down and the train begins to move, I want to include a good bit of foreshadowing here. Ron rummages through his bags and accidentally sets off the sneaker scope, which starts spinning and whistling just as Scabbers begins to move. It's such a subtle but clever touch, essentially warning us all that something mischievous is happening right under our nose, but Ron plays it off perfectly by saying the sneaker scope is just cheap and probably doesn't work properly. The Dementor sequence is something that the movies absolutely nailed in my opinion, and I don't really think there's a lot that we need to do here. The tension, the sound design, and the eerie atmosphere as the door slides open were just perfect. The only real difference will be including the moment where Neville and Ginny arrive as the lights all go out. It gives both characters more presence this season and just builds upon the larger Hogwarts community, not just the trio against the world. When the door slides open and the Dementor appears, once again, I'll just keep it very, very similar to what we got in the movie, although potentially there'll be a slightly different design of the Dementor just to make it a little bit more unique. Like in the movie, Harry collapses, hearing the echo of a screaming woman, and the screen cuts to black before we fade back in warmly and we see Lupin's smiling face over Harry, offering him chocolate. From here, the episode transitions to the arrival at Hogwarts as the trio walk into the entrance hall, and Ron and Hermione inform Harry about everything that happened on the train, with Lupin shooting something large and silver at the Dementor. This is slightly different from the movie, as in the movie we saw Lupin doing this, but obviously at this moment Harry had fainted. Essentially, Harry didn't see any of it, and as I've mentioned before, I do want the series to kind of follow the book example of telling most of the things that happen to Harry from his point of view. It would also make the reveal of the Patronus later on in the season a lot more dramatic and wondrous. Before they make their way into the Great Hall, Professor McGonagall intercepts Harry and Hermione and calls them into an empty chamber just off the entrance hall. Madame Pomfrey is already there, and she starts fussing over Harry and telling him that he needs rest and relaxation, perhaps in the hospital wing for the night. Harry insists he's fine, but McGonagall wants to know everything that happened about the Dementor, and after Harry tells her, she then is happy to dismiss him and says that she now needs to speak to Hermione. The inclusion of this moment is a perfect opportunity to provide a few more breadcrumbs regarding the time turn. The movie hinted at it, but the book planted those clues much earlier on and far more deliberately. And I'd want the show to follow suit with far more hints and comments and moments that only make sense in hindsight. We then transition to the Great Hall for the welcome feast, and as the camera glides past all of the house tables, we focus on Dumbledore as he rises to make his speech. He welcomes everybody back before introducing Professor Lupin as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, and tells everybody that Hagrid is going to be the new Care of Magical Creatures teacher. Finally, Dumbledore's tone darkens as he informs everybody that the Dementors will be stationed at Hogwarts this year. The camera pans across uneasy faces before we focus on Harry in a lingering shot, before we cut to black to end sequence 1. Before we go on, please remember to hit the subscribe button if you're enjoying this season, and remember to like the video and hit the notification bell so you're updated when I bring out more episodes for my vision for Season 3 of Harry Potter. Sequence 2 will cover Harry's first day of the new term, and it's a pretty action-packed one with 2 major classes. I think the movies did an excellent job with covering the classes that this sequence will cover, and it did it all in about 10 minutes. This sequence will probably be about 20 minutes long, so it will be very similar to what we got in the movie with just some additions here and there. So what I will do is go over the class and just kind of mention what I will be adding, as I won't really be taking anything away. Before we get into the classes, however, we do get the moment with the trio getting lost on their way to divination and coming across Sir Cadogan, who initially, after trying to fight the trio, says,
"Come, follow me, dear friends, and we shall find our goal, or else shall perish bravely in the charge."
And we have a brief frantic scene of the trio chasing Sir Cadogan through the castle as he bursts through different portraits on his way to the North Tower. There is a lot to cover in this episode, so this wouldn't be too long, maybe only a couple of minutes, but I do really want Sir Cadogan to play a pretty prominent part in this season. We then move on to divination with Professor Trelawney, and the main addition of this class will be that Trelawney makes a few other predictions to other students, such as telling Neville,
"After you've broken your first cup, would you be so kind as to select one of the blue patterned ones? I'm rather attached to the pink."
And she also says that
"Around Easter, one of our number will leave us forever."
She will also tell Lavender Brown that the thing she is dreading will happen at the beginning of November. This is slightly different from what she says in the book, for a reason I will get into later. These moments just allow there to be more character development for Trelawney, and it leads the class and the audience to be slightly undecided on whether or not she is a fraud, as Neville does actually go on to break his cup. The rest of the class is then very similar to the movie, with them looking at the tea leaves, Professor Trelawney looking in Harry's cup and seeing the Grim, which is an omen of death. We then move into Care of Magical Creatures, but before we do so, we see the trio making their way to the Forbidden Forest, discussing the events of divination. Now, in the book, they go to Transfiguration next, with McGonagall telling them all that Professor Trelawney always predicts the death of a student, but no one has actually died yet. I've decided decided to cut this for pacing reasons, especially because we don't actually see the class in the book, but instead we will have Hermione telling Harry and Ron that she heard this from McGonagall already, and she'll also go on to explain how she doesn't like divination and how arithmancy is better, and Ron goes on to question how she's already had arithmancy as she's been with them all morning. This is yet another breadcrumb. But essentially this conversation will give us all of the information that the book gave us, whilst also saving a little bit of time for more important things later on. The Care of Magical Creatures class will once again be very similar to the movie, and it will last for about the same amount of screen time as well. It does have some additions, such as the rest of the class interacting with different hippogriffs after Harry's flight. However, in order to combat this moment taking more time, Harry's actual flight on Buckbeak will only last about 30 seconds as he just flies around the paddock like in the book. And as Malfoy, Crabbe, Goyle, and Pansy Parkinson are tending to Buckbeak, Malfoy insults the hippogriff, who rears up and slashes his arm. And once again, with my vision of the series having a slightly higher age rating, we will see a splatter of blood, unlike the movie, which just showed Malfoy's robes being ripped. Hagrid picks up the screaming Malfoy, strides towards the camera, before we cut to black to end sequence 2. Sequence 3 of this episode is one that will require a little bit of reshuffling of events in order to end on a massive cliffhanger, however being done in such a way that doesn't massively impact the story. The first section of the sequence will be Professor Lupin's first Defense Against the Dark Arts class and the Boggart lesson. And there will be a fair few additions here, although to be honest, the movie scene is absolutely iconic, and I think most Harry Potter fans would agree that this scene is an absolute highlight from any Harry Potter film. In the book, there is a potions class first, with Snape doing his usual bullying of Harry and Neville, but I have decided to cut this as there will be plenty of other occasions where we will see a potions lesson in this season, and there is still a fair amount to cover in this sequence. Before we get to the Boggart lesson itself, the students arrive at the DADA classroom, and Lupin tells them it will be a practical lesson and to follow him. The camera follows Lupin and the Gryffindors as they make their way through the castle towards the staff room, which is an area we have already seen in the series. On their way, they come across Peeves, and we get the incredible moment from the book where Lupin casts a spell to shoot a wad of chewing gum out of a keyhole and straight up Peeves' nostril. This is another small moment that provides us with deeper world building and more character development for Lupin this time, showing that he still carries some of those more mischievous traits from his youth. Once the class enter the staff room, we get a brief conversation with Professor Snape where he goes on to insult Neville, which is then the catalyst for the upcoming Boggart scene. Once again, the scene in the movie is absolutely iconic in both its contents and its style, and it will be interesting to see if HBO decide to keep this kind of tone and style, just like the Fantastic Beasts movie did when we saw Dumbledore teaching the same lesson. The actual events of the scene will mainly be fleshed out from what we saw in the movie, with us seeing both ones that were included, such as Snape in Neville's grandmother's clothes and Ron's giant spider, and ones that were left out, like Parvati's mummy, Seamus's banshee, and Dean's severed hand. Once again, the inclusion of these moments not only expands the wizarding world into introducing us to more dark creatures, but also enhances character development for a lot of the side characters, showing insight into their different fears. And just like in the movie, when Harry steps up to face the Boggart, Lupin jumps in front of him, the Boggart turns into a silvery orb before Lupin flicks his wand, and the Boggart becomes a balloon. The scene ends with Neville facing the Boggart one more time. We see a brief glimpse of Snape in that green dress, before Neville shouts with laughter, and the Boggart explodes. However, as everyone is cheering, the camera pans to Harry's face, and we see him looking disappointed and confused. As we slowly zoom in on Harry's face, the screen crossfades into the first of this season's Hogwarts changing motifs, highlighting the change into October and Halloween. Now, in the book, there are a few events that happen first, such as a Quidditch training session, Lavender receiving news about her rabbit, and Crookshanks chasing Scabbers. Don't worry, I will be including all of these moments, but not just yet. There's no real need for these moments to happen right now, and this episode is pretty packed. so I've decided to reshuffle events ever so slightly without it affecting the flow of the story. We cut to Halloween morning, with Harry waking up in a gloomy mood as the rest of the Gryffindors excitedly get ready to go to Hogsmeade. Harry tries to hide his disappointment as Ron and Hermione tell him they'll bring him loads of sweets from Honeydukes, and we follow them through the castle as they arrive at Filch, checking everyone's permission slips in a line, and we see Malfoy throwing insults at Harry. Once the others leave, Harry aimlessly walks through the castle and bumps into Professor Lupin, who invites him into his office for a cup of tea. Here we get an absolutely lovely scene from the book, with Lupin and Harry sharing a really close bonding moment, with Lupin showing Harry the Grindylow, gently teasing him about the tea leave reading, and offering insight into Harry's character whilst talking about the incident with the boggart. As I said, it's a great moment of connection between the two, but then it suddenly gets tense when Snape arrives carrying a smoking potion. Harry, not so subtly, tries to warn Lupin about Snape, saying,
"Some people reckon he'd do anything to get the Defense Against the Dark Arts job."
However, Lupin essentially ignores Harry and goes on to drink the potion anyway. And this potion is yet again a wonderful clue into Lupin's condition. We then move into the climax of the episode as we cut to the Halloween feast, which once again will be a visual masterpiece, and we will see Ron and Hermione pushing a ton of sweets into Harry's lap and telling him all about Hogsmeade. The sequence ends as the Gryffindors head up to the Gryffindor common room, but as they arrive, they see that the fat lady's portrait has been slashed to pieces. Dumbledore and the teachers arrive, and as they are examining the portrait, Peeves arrives. Dumbledore goes on to question Peeves, who gleefully says,
"Nasty temper he's got, that Sirius Black."
We cut to black, and the credits roll. We open on a bustle of students, all squeezing through the Great Hall doors into the Great Hall, and we see Professor Dumbledore standing at the front, waiting for them. He tells the students that the staff need to conduct a thorough search of the castle, and with a flick of his wand, conjures up hundreds of purple sleeping bags. We see snappy shots of students scrambling for sleeping bags and finding good spots to sleep in, before we focus on a group of Gryffindor students all chatting loudly and theorising about how Sirius Black came into the castle. And in the book we hear quite a few students, some of whom are unnamed, making suggestions, and once again that just expands upon the student life at Hogwarts, and it's definitely something I will include here. We then cut to a few hours ahead, where the majority of the students are asleep, but then we see Harry, Ron and Hermione, who are all still awake, muttering to each other. At that point, Dumbledore enters the hall and proceeds, like in the movie, to have a conversation with Snape and Percy, almost word for word what we got there. We see Snape casting suspicions about a certain appointment Dumbledore has made, which he shuts down instantly. The camera pans down to the trio, who are all staring at each other in confusion and silence, before we cut to black, and the title sequence rolls. After the title sequence, we cut to the trio heading up to the Gryffindor dormitory, where they find Sir Cadogan, who has replaced the fat lady. After a brief and funny exchange, the trio enter the common room and they find Oliver Wood and the rest of the Quidditch team waiting for Harry. Wood informs the team that they're now going to be playing Hufflepuff, not Slytherin, in their upcoming match, as they say Malfoy's arm is too injured, although the team correctly guesses that the real reason is because the team don't want to play in the dreadful weather. Wood also mentions Cedric Diggory, which is the first nod to this character, as in the movie we only meet him in Goblet of Fire, but it's quite important to introduce him in this season in my opinion, as Harry and Cedric have a complicated relationship. The Quidditch team's meeting is then interrupted as Crookshanks leaps at Scabbers, and this leads to a brief and frantic chase around the common room with people trying to catch Crookshanks before Ron goes to save Scabbers. The first major argument between Ron and Hermione from this season then erupts, and I definitely want these arguments to pop up all the way through the season, just as they do in the book, as it's a pretty major point. Now, in the previous episode I mentioned I had cut the potions lesson that takes place before the boggart lesson, but don't worry, we're getting it now. After the boggart lesson, the book goes on to explain how Snape must have heard about Neville's boggart and proceeds to be even nastier than usual, and even though I have reshuffled things ever so slightly, this plays perfectly into the upcoming lesson. We cut to the Gryffindors and Slytherins waiting outside the potions classroom, and we see Lavender Brown, in tears, being comforted by other Gryffindors. She says that she just received news that her baby rabbit was killed and that she should have known because Professor Trelawney predicted it. Hermione then logically questions the prediction, saying that the rabbit was probably killed earlier and that if it was a baby rabbit, how could Lavender be dreading it dying? Ron goes on to say,
"Don't mind Hermione, Lavender. She doesn't think other people's pets matter very much."
Once again deepening the rift between Ron and Hermione that plays such an important part in this season. Inside the classroom, we see Snape prowling amongst the students, criticising their shrinking solutions. When he reaches Neville, he goes on to insult the colour of his potion and announces that he will feed a drop of his potion to Trevor the Toad at the end of the class, forbidding Hermione to help him. Neville whispers to Hermione,
"Help me,"
before we cut to Harry and Ron, who are sharing a table with Malfoy, who still has his arm in a sling. Malfoy smugly orders them to prepare his ingredients for him and goes on to goad Harry about Sirius Black, saying,
"If it was me, I'd want revenge. I'd hunt him down myself."
And this sets up a key thread for later in the episode. The sequence then ends with Snape feeding a drop of potion to Trevor. The tension builds and builds until we hear a pop and Trevor shrinks to the size of a tadpole. However, as the Gryffindors are cheering, Snape flicks his wand, returning Trevor to full size, and says,
5 points from Gryffindor. I told you not to help him, Miss Granger."
We cut to black to end Sequence 1. Sequence 2 covers 2 main scenes that were actually included in the Prisoner of Azkaban movie, so here they will just be more expanded. We open on the exterior of Hogwarts during a violent storm, which will set up the conditions Harry has to face in the Quidditch match. And when we cut to the interior of Hogwarts, we see Harry rushing through the corridors, being tailed by Oliver Wood, who is shouting suggestions at him like,
"Diggory's got a very fast swerve, Harry, so you might want to try looping him."
We follow Harry as he hurtles round corners, squeezes through groups of students, before he bursts into the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, and he freezes in shock as he sees Snape standing at the front of the class. As I mentioned before, this scene was included in the movie, so here it will just be a bit more fleshed out. We obviously still have Snape teaching about werewolves and setting them a giant essay, but we will also include the students as a whole defending Professor Lupin and standing up to Snape's bullying. I think it's really important to include this as it demonstrates that it's not just Harry who hates Snape, it's everyone. And the scene ends with Snape calling Hermione an insufferable know-it-all, to which Ron says,
"You asked us a question and she knows the answer. Why ask if you don't want to be told?"
This moment marks the end of Ron and Hermione's feud for now. We then cut to another exterior shot, this time of the Quidditch pitch at dawn, and the conditions are even worse than the day before. We then cut to Harry asleep in bed, twitching as a slight breeze is ruffling his hair. He wakes with a start and sees Peeves blowing in his ear, and after he swats him away, he gets out of bed and heads downstairs. On his way, he comes across Crookshanks trying to sneak into the boys' dormitory. Harry nudges Crookshanks back down the stairs, saying,
"Leave Scabbers alone."
Before we cut to the Gryffindor Quidditch team in the changing room, pulling on their Quidditch robes and staggering out into the storm for the match. Once again, this scene was obviously included in the movie, but it was only 2 minutes long, and I think we can allow for at least 10 minutes, if not more. This means that we'll include a lot of the moments from the match that the movie cut, as well as some additions to the atmosphere at the end of the match. The main addition, though, will be the first half of the game. We follow Harry as he flies around, trying to navigate the storm. However, through filming and editing techniques, we will be completely disoriented, just like Harry, into anything that is going on. He flies this way and that, being buffeted by the wind, and almost collides with numerous players as he can't see anything through his rain-splattered glasses. Eventually we see Oliver Wood signalling at Harry to come down as he's called a time out, and we will then get the incredible moment from the book where Hermione appears out of nowhere and casts a repelling charm on Harry's glasses. The rest of the match will then be very similar to the movie, as two key things happen. Firstly, as Harry is looking for the snitch, he sees the silhouette of a giant black dog in the topmost stand, and as he is staring at it, he hears Oliver Wood shout his name, and he sees Cedric Diggory streaking towards the snitch. Now in the movie we get a kind of wild chase scene as the Dementors appear and essentially try to catch Harry, but this is different in the book, and it will be different here. As Harry is chasing after Cedric, the noise of the crowd and the storm start to fade, and with the power of editing, the music starts to fade too, and the colour palette becomes gloomier and gloomier. We hear the faint echo of a screaming woman before Harry looks down and sees at least 100 Dementors staring up at him. The screaming becomes louder and louder before Harry slips sideways off his broom and plummets towards the ground before we cut to black to end Sequence 2. Sequence 3 opens up in the hospital wing in a similar way to the movie as Harry wakes up. Harry sees Ron and Hermione waiting for him, as well as the rest of the Gryffindor team, who go on to explain about the match. I especially want to include the moment where Harry asks where Wood is and Fred says,
"Still in the showers. We think he's trying to drown himself."
I just really want to include as many moments as possible of Wood's fanatic obsession with Quidditch. They also add that Cedric Diggory felt incredibly guilty about catching the snitch, and even though this seems like a small moment, it is kind of important for Cedric's character, as well as with Amos Diggory in the next season. Finally, we have the incredibly sad moment that the movie actually nailed pretty perfectly, with Hermione tipping the remains of Harry's Nimbus 2000 onto the bed. We then move into our next Hogwarts changing motif from autumn to winter, with loads of Christmas decorations popping up around the school. This juxtaposes quite nicely from the previous moment with Harry and his broomstick, as usually Christmas at Hogwarts is the happiest time of the year, but this time Harry's feeling pretty down about everything regarding the Nimbus 2000, the Dementors, and not being able to go to Hogsmeade. We then cut to Defense Against the Dark Arts at the end of a lesson with Lupin about Hinky Punks. We won't actually watch this lesson because of time restraints, but it will definitely be cool to see the Hinky Punk at the front of the class, once again expanding upon Wizarding World lore by introducing a new creature. Before dismissing the class, Lupin goes on to tell the class to not worry, as he will speak to Professor Snape about them not doing his werewolf essay, and as they are leaving, he calls Harry to stay behind. We then have a brief conversation between Lupin and Harry, where Lupin asks about his broomstick and drops a major hint saying that the Whomping Willow was planted at Hogwarts the day he arrived. Harry goes on to ask Lupin if he can teach him how to repel Dementors, and Lupin agrees, but after the Christmas holidays. This is a perfect segue, as the next scene will be during the Christmas break, with Harry waving goodbye to Ron and Hermione as they head to Hogsmeade. On his way back to the Gryffindor common room, he is intercepted by Fred and George, and just like in the movie, we get the moment where they hand over the Marauders map. This will be almost identical to the movie, perhaps with the conversation just going on a little bit longer, with the twins going into a little more depth as to how they stole the map from Filch, and explaining that there are various passages out of Hogwarts, but there's only one that they use. Now in the movie, we cut straight to Harry entering Honeydukes. However, I want to include the moments before this of Harry's journey through the passage. We cut to Harry beside the one-eyed witch statue, and as he looks at the Marauders map, we see a mini animation of a tiny little Harry tapping the statue with his wand and saying Descendium. We then follow Harry and we have some pretty snappy claustrophobic shots of Harry making his way down a seemingly endless tunnel. I quite like how in the game Hogwarts Legacy, the passage to Hogsmeade is quite windy with various different obstacles to overcome. It was a pretty fun element of the game. However, in the book, it's described more like a straight line that goes on forever, and that's kind of what I would want to do for the series. Eventually, Harry makes his way up a steep incline before his head collides with solid stone, and as he reaches up, he pushes open a trap door and finds himself in the cellar of Honeydukes. Unlike in the movie where Harry finds Ron and Hermione outside the Shrieking Shack, he finds them in Honeydukes examining different suites. He sneaks up behind them and reveals himself before they head out into Hogsmeade High Street. We will only get a brief glimpse of the exteriors of the different shops here, but not to worry, as unlike the movie, we will be returning to Hogsmeade again, seeing the interiors of different shops. Ron suggests that they should go to the Three Broomsticks for a butterbeer, and as they enter, we move into the climax scene of the episode. The trio head to the bar and order 3 butterbeers before they find a table next to a Christmas tree. However, as soon as they sit down, the door opens again, and in walks Cornelius Fudge, Professor Flitwick, Hagrid, and Professor McGonagall. Hermione quickly casts Wingardium Leviosa and moves the Christmas tree in front of them, whilst Ron shoves Harry under the table. The teachers, Fudge and Rosmerta, go on to have a conversation about the Dementors in the village, Sirius Black, and Black's backstory. Rosmerta says that she couldn't believe it when she heard that Black had turned to the dark side, and Fudge says it's even worse than she could have imagined. McGonagall goes on to ask Rosmerta if she remembers anything about Black at school, and asks her if she remembers who Black's best friend was. To which Rosmerta says,
"Naturally. Quite the double act, Sirius Black and James Potter."
Harry drops his tankard in shock. We hold on his face before we cut to black and the credits roll. We open where we left off in the previous episode, with Harry overhearing the conversation between the teachers in the Three Broomsticks, and we're going to move in to a kind of flashback sequence as Fudge, McGonagall, Flitwick, Hagrid, and Rosmerta all talk about Sirius Black's backstory. Now, as everybody knows, one of the biggest things that Harry Potter fans have always wanted is a proper Marauder's backstory. Now, obviously, this isn't it. We're only going to get a small portion of the story here, but we will definitely get a partial retelling of events. Basically, a skewed version of Black's story. As each person around the table adds to the story, we will see flashes of events of what they believe happened. It would be dramatic and emotional, but crucially, it's wrong. We'd see Sirius laughing manically in the street, Pettigrew screaming, the explosion and the whole aftermath, but all from the Ministry point of view. Basically a version of the story that is there to make Sirius look guilty. This is especially powerful because it plays into this theme of perception, of the truth being twisted depending on who's telling the story, something that is a key theme of this season. And then later in the season, when we finally learn the truth, we will revisit these exact same shots, but this time we'll know what really happened with crucial context. It'd be a really good visual way to demonstrate just how unreliable Wizarding World rumours really are, and how even the best witches and wizards can get things wrong. I'm not calling Fudge one of the best witches or wizards, by the way, but I'm talking more about McGonagall and even Dumbledore. The scene ends with Fudge and the teachers finishing their drinks before they exit the Three Broomsticks. We then see Ron and Hermione lower their heads beneath the table to stare at Harry, and we focus on his face, looking mortified, before we cut to black and the title sequence rolls. We cut to Harry making his way back to Hogwarts, completely dazed, angry, and confused. The editing here should be fast and disorienting as he enters Honeydukes and pushes past students, stumbles down the cellar stairs, through the trapdoor, and bumps into the walls as he makes his way down the passageway. His mind is racing with the things he's heard, and we will hear echoes of what he heard the teachers and Fudge say, such as,
"You'd have thought Black and Potter were brothers."
I comforted the murdering traitor.
Lily and James Sirius, how could you?
We then cut to the Gryffindor common room with Harry storming up the stairs to his dormitory, still hearing those echoes in his head, before he gets to his trunk, rips it open, and starts rummaging for his photo album. He flips through it until he finds a picture of his parents' wedding day, and then we see a picture of a young Sirius Black standing next to James, laughing. There are a few moments in the book series where Harry revisits this photo album that Hagrid gave him, and it'll be really nice for the series to include them as well, as in the movies we only really saw it at the end of Philosopher's Stone and the beginning of Chamber of Secrets. We then move into a brief dream sequence where Harry sees flashes of Sirius Black on the wanted posters and in the photo album, and imagines his voice saying,
"It has happened, my lord. The Potters have made me their secret keeper."
Cut to Harry waking up with a start before stumbling down the stairs to find Ron and Hermione waiting for him. They go on to try and calm him down about the conversation, and Ron suggests going to visit Hagrid to calm Harry down and also to take his mind off things. However, Harry says, "Sure, let's go. I'm going to ask him why he never told me about Sirius Black," which was not Ron's intention at all. We then cut to Hagrid's hut, and the atmosphere completely shifts as it's incredibly warm and inviting with a fire crackling. However, when they see Hagrid, they see that he is devastated, and he shows them the letter saying that Buckbeak has a trial coming up in London after the incident with Malfoy. Now, in the previous episode, I did cut the moment where the trio go to visit Hagrid after the attack. However, a lot of that dialogue will be brought over to here. We can have Hagrid and the trio talk about how it wasn't his fault what happened to Malfoy, and how Hagrid's lessons have completely changed since the incident. How he's completely lost his confidence, and how everything is now incredibly safe and dull. We'll also see Buckbeak in the corner of Hagrid's hut as Hagrid says,
"I couldn't leave him tied up out there in the snow, all on his own, at Christmas."
Sequence 1 ends with the trio telling Hagrid that they will help him to research different magical creature trials, setting up the subplot that runs throughout the next few episodes. Sequence 2 opens up on Christmas morning with Ron throwing a pillow at Harry's face. We first see Harry open a few parcels from Mrs. Weasley, which I always enjoy reading about, before he notices a long thin package at the end of his bed, and when he unwraps it, he sees it's the firebolt. Yes, we're actually getting it now, like in the book, as probably the only thing I hate about the Prisoner of Azkaban movie is how they shoehorned it in to the end of the movie, and that ridiculous freeze frame. Ron is ecstatic, but when Hermione arrives, she is very suspicious, but as she is questioning who sent the broomstick, Crookshanks launches himself at Scabbers again. This is a small moment, but it ties in pretty massively to how this episode will end. Then we move into Christmas dinner, and like in season 1, I want this moment to be incredibly magical and wondrous again. But unlike in the first season where the Christmas feast was a giant grand affair, this one is a lot smaller and more intimate. There are only a handful of people there, mainly teachers and a couple of students, but we will really get this sense of a sort of odd family. It sounds weird as it's teachers and students, but to Harry this is still way more of a family than he ever had at Privet Drive. We then get the Christmas dinner and the magical Christmas crackers, with Snape pulling one and ending up with a vulture-topped witch's hat, which he promptly swaps with Dumbledore. This is just a subtle nod to the moment earlier in the season with Neville's boggart. Professor Trelawney then arrives in a dramatic fashion and goes on to say that she couldn't possibly sit down because then there would be 13, which is incredibly unlucky, and the first to rise will be the first to die. Now, there is actually a pretty interesting fan theory that this prediction does come true, as Scabbers is actually Peter Pettigrew, so there were already 13 people at the table, and when Dumbledore stands up to greet Trelawney, he is the first to rise, and funnily enough, he is the first to die. I'm not suggesting that this is actually canon, but it would be a pretty nice touch for HBO to include this little wink to the fandom. After dinner, Harry and Ron, still buzzing about the firebolt, head up to the common room so they can take it for a spin. But before they can do so, Professor McGonagall barges in and confiscates it. Ron rounds on Hermione, who goes on to say,
"Because I thought, and Professor McGonagall agrees with me, that broom was probably sent to Harry by Sirius Black."
We cut to black to end sequence 2. We open the next sequence on a montage of classes, which in my opinion is a really nice way to show how time has passed and that the Christmas holidays are now over. We see a brief clip of Care of Magical Creatures where Hagrid has introduced salamanders which keep everybody warm in the cold weather, and it also shows that the conversation the trio had with him in his hut seem to have worked. Then we briefly see divination, where they've moved on to palmistry, and Trelawney takes Harry's hand and gasps that he's got the shortest lifeline she's ever seen. And finally, we move to the end of a Defense Against the Dark Arts class, and after the class leaves, Harry approaches Lupin and asks him about defending himself from Dementors. And that leads us into the first Patronus lesson. I want this scene to be similar to the movie, but expanded, with Harry struggling with the incantation, taking numerous attempts at the Dementor, and hearing new voices in his head. Essentially, each time the Dementor approaches, he will hear new echoes from his parents' final moments. First, Lily screams, as we've heard before, but then she goes on to plead,
"Not Harry! Not Harry! Please, I'll do anything!"
Then Voldemort telling her to stand aside. And finally, James shouting to Lily to run as he will hold Voldemort off. It would be absolutely chilling, to be honest with you, and it's a real reminder for the audience that when Harry is facing the Dementor, he's really fighting his own trauma. It's something that once again an increased age rating such as TV-14 would really be able to handle a lot better than a PG movie. From there we transition into our next Hogwarts changing motif from winter into spring, with snow melting, the castle brightening up, and Quidditch training starting up again. We then cut to the interior of Hogwarts, where we see Harry walking with Oliver Wood on his way to his next Patronus class. Wood is ranting about how Slytherin beating Ravenclaw is really good for their chances of winning the Quidditch Cup, and how McGonagall told him off for caring more about Quidditch than Harry's life when he asked her to give Harry the firebolt back.
"Just because I told her, I didn't care if it threw you off, as long as you caught the snitch on it first."
Wood is really quite unhinged in this book, but I absolutely love it, especially as this is his final year at Hogwarts, and I really want to give him his time to shine in this season. We then follow Harry as he heads into the next Patronus lesson. However, this time the actual events of the lesson will be a lot shorter. But after the lesson, Lupin offers Harry a butterbeer, and they proceed to have a conversation about Dementors, what they are, what they do, and the horror of the Dementor's kiss. This is once again just a lovely character moment for Lupin, and also a really good bonding moment for Harry and Lupin together. We then cut to Harry on his way back to the Gryffindor common room, where he walks straight into Professor McGonagall, who goes on to give him the firebolt. We then move into the climax of this episode. Harry returns to the common room and finds Ron sitting by the fire. Harry shows an ecstatic Ron that he got the firebolt back, and goes on to admit that Hermione was only trying to protect him and that they should probably owe her an apology. Ron agrees, but before they can do so, he decides to take the firebolt upstairs for Harry. A few seconds after he disappears from view, however, we hear a sudden yell. He comes back down the stairs holding a bedsheet and heads straight to Hermione, who is reading at a table. He shoves the sheet under her nose and we see it's splattered with blood. And he goes on to say that Scabbers is gone. And when Hermione looks even more confused and scared, Ron shouts,
"And you know what was on the floor?"
He throws a handful of ginger cat hairs onto her book. We focus first on Ron's furious face, and then Hermione's terrified one, before we zoom in on the cat hairs, before we cut to black and the credits roll. We open with Harry, Ron, Fred and George all trudging down to the Quidditch pitch, with Ron still fuming about Scabbers and Crookshanks. He's absolutely convinced that Hermione's cat has eaten Scabbers, and he can't believe that she's still defending him. Fred and George, for once, are actually trying to calm Ron down and trying to offer support, saying,
"Come on, Ron. You were always saying how boring Scabbers was."
What I really want is to show just how fractured the trio has got at this point, as this is the biggest fallout they've ever had. Harry's caught in the middle, trying to keep the peace, but both of them are way too stubborn to listen. It's such a small and human moment, but it's incredibly sad, as this is one of the few times that we see genuine cracks in their friendship, and it makes their eventual reconciliation so much more meaningful. As they finally reach the Quidditch pitch, however, the mood changes into excitement, as this is the first time we will see Harry on the Firebolt. Now, in the movies, as I've mentioned before, I don't really like how the Firebolt was kind of glossed over. It's this legendary broomstick, the fastest in the world, and we never really got to see what makes it so special. And in this episode, I'd love for HBO to show off just how incredible it is. We move into the Quidditch training session, and the camera tracks Harry as he shoots into the sky like a red and gold blur, while the rest of the team stare in awe. I want to see cinematic close-ups of the Firebolt cutting through the clouds, the sound design focusing on the sound of rushing wind, and sunlight glinting off the handle. After a brief montage of the session, Harry lands and gives the Firebolt to Ron, who takes it hesitantly before kicking off into the sky. I really like the idea that this moment foreshadows him being on the Quidditch team in Season 5. We see his enthusiasm and potential here, especially as nobody is watching, and it just ties together the future of the story really nicely in a nice natural way. The scene then winds down as the sun dips below the trees and Harry and Ron head back to the castle. But then something catches Harry's eye, two glowing orbs in the distance, and he freezes, thinking he's seen the Grim. But when Ron casts Lumos, they see it's actually Crookshanks skulking in the grass. Ron immediately tenses, but before he can throw something at Crookshanks, Crookshanks streaks off into the distance. The boys shrug it off and head towards the castle, but we don't follow them. Instead, the camera lingers on the forest edge, and we see Crookshanks trotting through the trees, before he comes to a stop in front of a silhouette of a giant black dog. The two regard each other for a moment, before we cut to black and the title sequence rolls. We open on a close-up of the Firebolt, and as we zoom out, we see that it is over Harry's shoulder as he walks into the Great Hall. The Gryffindor students part like a guard of honor with all eyes on the broomstick. It's a great moment of pride for Harry, as it's finally something good that's happening to him, as this year has just been pretty horrendous so far. From there, we cut to a quick montage of the students heading to the Quidditch pitch for the match, and this has kind of become a bit of a stylistic motif throughout the seasons, and it's something that I think we're getting kind of used to at this point, and definitely something that HBO can play with visually. Then we move into the Gryffindor versus Ravenclaw match, and I really want this to be a standout moment of this episode. And we finally meet Cho Chang here for the first time. Just like with Cedric, we actually meet her in the third book, not the fourth one like in the movie. Harry notices her instantly, her confidence, her speed, and her smile, and there's definitely an unspoken connection here that the show should be able to convey. Throughout the match, Lee Jordan's commentary will be incredible as always, as he bigs up the Firebolt and its speed and performance, with McGonagall saying,
"Jordan, are you being paid to advertise Firebolts? Get on with the commentary."
It would honestly be a proper showcase of what Quidditch can be when treated properly, with it being immersive, emotional, and high-paced. Throughout the match, Cho Chang is constantly blocking Harry in order to negate the Firebolt, with Wood saying to just knock her off her broomstick. As the match reaches its peak, Harry hears Cho Chang scream, and when he looks down to the pitch, he sees 3 Dementors staring up at him. But this time, he is ready. He plunges his hand into his robes, pulls out his wand, and performs a Patronus straight at the Dementors. We don't see it clearly as Harry is focused on the snitch, but we do catch a glimpse of something enormous shooting out of his wand and onto the pitch. The crowd goes wild as Harry catches the snitch, and as he lands, the tension turns to chaos. McGonagall storms onto the pitch furiously, and we see that the Dementors were actually Malfoy, Crabbe, Goyle, and Marcus Flint, wearing big cloaks. The sequence ends with the Gryffindors celebrating in the common room, but as this sequence is pretty long already, we don't linger too long. The camera drifts through the fading party, and we see Harry and Ron heading up to their dormitory, exhausted but happy. Harry climbs into bed, pulls the curtain shut, and goes to sleep as the screen fades to black. For a moment, everything is peaceful, before we suddenly hear a scream in the darkness, and Harry awakes with a jolt. He sees Ron, who's sitting up in bed with his curtains slashed, who says,
"Black! Sirius Black! With a knife!"
We cut to black to end sequence 1. Sequence 2 opens in chaos as the common room is packed again, although this time everyone is in pyjamas, whispering and muttering. We see Ron retelling the story to Percy that he was lying in bed before he woke up and saw Sirius Black standing over him with a knife. McGonagall then arrives and demands to know what happened. I'd love this moment to capture just how human McGonagall can be, as I honestly think she is genuinely scared at this point, as somebody has broken into her student's dormitory. She goes on to question Sir Cadogan, who proudly says that of course he let a man into the common room, and when McGonagall asks what about the passwords, he says,
"He had 'em, had the whole weeks, milady. Read 'em off a little piece of paper."
McGonagall demands to know who's been leaving the passwords lying around, and in the silence, Neville raises his hand. Poor Neville. I mean, it is a great moment of innocence and consequence though, and it perfectly sets up his growth for the future. We then cut to breakfast the next morning with Ron surrounded by a group of excited first years as he retells his story like a war hero, clearly loving the attention. Meanwhile, Neville's howler arrives and he sprints from the Great Hall before we hear his grandmother's voice echoing in the corridor. Harry also receives a note from Hagrid, who asks if they want to go to his hut for a cup of tea that afternoon, and then we cut to Hagrid's hut. They talk about the trial and Hermione, with Ron still being bitter but Hagrid trying to convince him to forgive her. It's a heartfelt little moment, with Hagrid showing how much he knows about friendship and loyalty, even if he struggles to express it sometimes. Afterwards we cut to the common room with Harry and Ron seeing the notice board where the new Hogsmeade trip has been announced. Ron asks Harry if he'll go, but Hermione says that she'll tell McGonagall if he does. I want this to feel incredibly tense and real, as these are three friends who truly love each other, but they are falling apart under the weight of everything that's happening. Ron snaps and says,
"So now you're trying to get Harry expelled? Haven't you done enough damage this year?"
before Hermione storms off, and Harry stays quiet before whispering to Ron that he will go, but he will take the invisibility cloak. From here, we shift perspectives. One thing I noticed I've been doing is simply following Harry from scene to scene, which is obviously fair enough as the series is from his perspective, but sometimes it would be nice to mix things up a little bit. We actually cut to Snape skulking the halls of Hogwarts, docking points from students and being his usual mean self. This also ties in quite nicely to the title of this episode. We then watch Snape round a corner and he sees Harry standing suspiciously by the one-eyed witch statue. They exchange words and Snape tells Harry to go to his dormitory, and as Harry walks away he glances over his shoulder and sees Snape examining the statue before he eventually leaves. Harry waits until Snape is gone before rushing back to the statue, tapping it with his wand and saying Descendium. We cut to the Hogsmeade High Street. We see Ron standing outside Honeydukes before we suddenly hear Harry's voice saying "I'm behind you" as he's under the cloak. The Hogsmeade sequence that follows is something that I think Potter fans have been dying to see. Firstly, Harry and Ron visit Zonko's and we'll see the shelves packed with all sorts of wizarding joke items. Then they head to the post office, which is filled with owls of every size and colour, labelled with different prices for different different distances. It's the kind of sequence that lets us breathe a little bit and reminds us of the wonder of the wizarding world before things get dark again. And it all leads to the Shrieking Shack scene where Malfoy, Crabbe and Goyle show up. And like in the movie, with Harry under the cloak, he proceeds to throw snowballs and mud at them. But then Goyle trips backwards and his foot catches on the invisibility cloak, which pulls off, revealing Harry's floating head. Malfoy screams, and the three of them sprint off in the direction of the castle, before we cut to black to end Sequence 2. Sequence 3 opens in darkness, with Harry sprinting through the passageway back to Hogwarts. He bursts out of the statue, mud-splattered and sweating, before he suddenly comes face to face with Snape. The next scene is absolutely massive in my opinion, and it's a full 10 to 15 minute sequence of Harry heading with Snape to his office and everything that happens in there. And I'd also keep it almost word for word what we got in the book. It's one of my favourite interactions between the two of them, and it peels back so many layers for both of them. Snape tells Harry that Malfoy came back with a very interesting story. He tells Harry that he's not permitted to be in Hogsmeade. In fact, he says,
"Your head is not allowed in Hogsmeade. No part of your body has permission to be in Hogsmeade."
Snape accuses Harry of being arrogant like his father, at which Harry snaps and shouts at Snape that he knows that his father saved Snape's life. The tension here is probably the highest we've ever seen between Snape and Harry, as years of resentment and grief crash together. Snape searches Harry's pockets and finds the Zonko's products and doesn't believe a word of Harry's excuses. Then he picks up the Marauder's map. The camera lingers on Snape's face as he tries to read it, and we hear the insults.
"Mr. Mooney presents his compliments to Professor Snape and begs him to keep his abnormally large nose out of other people's business. Mr. Prongs agrees with Mr. Mooney and would like to add that Professor Snape is an ugly git. Mr. Padfoot would like to register his astonishment that an idiot like that ever became a professor.
Mr. Wormtail bids Professor Snape good day and advises him to wash his hair, the slime ball."
The tone shifts from suspicion to humiliation to cold fury. Snape goes on to call Lupin with flue powder, and we see Lupin's outline spinning in the fireplace before he steps out into the office. As he covers for Harry, we focus on Snape looking at Lupin with pure disdain. I think it's sometimes forgotten just how much Snape dislikes Lupin, just as he does with James and Sirius, and I really want to see the years of history reflected here. Ron then bursts in, backing up Harry's story, saying, and Snape has no choice but to let Harry go. Once they're out, Lupin turns on Harry, and this is honestly one of my favourite moments from the Prisoner of Azkaban movie and the book, with Lupin showing a more stern and disappointed side, and Harry looking devastated. It's definitely something that I would keep almost identical to what we got in the movie. The climax of the episode then begins as Harry and Ron walk back to the common room in silence. As they arrive, they see Hermione waiting for them. Ron snaps first, saying,
"Come to have a good gloat."
But we see Hermione is crying, and as she looks up, she says that Hagrid has lost his appeal, and Buckbeak will be executed. We hold on that for a few beats, before the screen cuts to black, and the credits roll silently. The episode will start with probably the shortest cold open of this season so far, as we hear the narration of Hagrid's letter that he wrote to Hermione.
"Dear Hermione, we lost. I'm allowed to bring him back to Hogwarts. Execution date to be fixed. Beaky has enjoyed London. I won't forget all the help you gave us. Hagrid."
As we listen to the narration of Hagrid writing the letter, we'll see him on the night bus in a suit, crying on his way back to Hogwarts, with Buckbeak lying on the floor. As the narration ends, we cut to black, and the title sequence rolls. After the title sequence, we cut to Harry and Ron finishing the letter, and then Ron goes on to say that there's still the appeal, and this time he will help Hermione with research. At which Hermione throws her arms around Ron, apologises about Scabbers, and this marks the end of their massive fallout. This is a really nice moment, and honestly this whole sequence is actually filled with quite a lot of happy and hopeful moments, which juxtaposes quite heavily for the direction of the next two sequences. We then cut to the end of a Care of Magical Creatures class, with Hagrid telling the trio exactly what happened at the trial, and afterwards, as he's heading up to his hut, we get the incredible moment where Hermione slaps Malfoy after he insults Hagrid. This moment in the movie is incredible, and here the only real difference is that unlike in the movie where Hermione pulls out her wand first before punching Malfoy, Hermione will walk straight up to Malfoy and slap him around the face before pulling out her wand. Tom Felton did an incredible job with this moment in the movie, however I would still like to see maybe a little more of just how much of a coward Malfoy is. This moment ends with Hermione saying to Harry,
"Harry, you'd better beat him in the Quidditch final."
Which is a perfect segue into the rest of the sequence. In the book, they head to Charms and Divination next, but in order for this episode to run smoothly, that will come later. We then move into a montage that takes place around the school in anticipation for the upcoming match, with small scuffles breaking out between Gryffindor and Slytherin students here and there. This once again demonstrates the student experience of life at Hogwarts, as Quidditch is such an important thing, something that the movies definitely overlooked. The montage ends with the trio and a load of other Gryffindor students in the common room studying for their exams, as they are also approaching, and we'll see the rest of the Gryffindor Quidditch team dealing with the nerves in their own way, including Oliver Wood prodding figures around a mini Quidditch pitch. Wood then comes over to Harry and tells him again the importance of not catching the snitch until Gryffindor are at least 50 points up in order for them to win the trophy. Wood then tells the rest of the team to go to bed, and then we cut to the Quidditch match. Just as the Gryffindor team kick into the air, the Slytherins arrive on dragons, and we get a frantic chase sequence with Harry trying to escape them before he looks down and realises he's forgotten his firebolt and starts plummeting towards the ground. He wakes with a start, and we realise it was a dream. I've said before how I really want the show to include quite a lot of these wild dreams that Harry has fairly often, and this would be an incredible one if they got it right. We then follow Harry as he stands up and heads to his bedside table for a glass of water, and as he's looking out of the window, he sees Crookshanks skulking around the edge of the forest, and as he looks closer, he sees the outline of that giant black dog again, walking alongside him. However, after he wakes Ron to see if he can see it, he notices that the cat and dog have vanished. And this short moment is such a nice way to hint towards the end of this episode. We then cut to the actual Quidditch match, and this will be an absolute standout moment of this episode, and honestly one of the standouts of this season. The build-up will be incredibly tense, with nothing but a heartbeat sound pounding as Harry and the rest of the team pull on their robes and head out onto the pitch, standing across from the Slytherins. Everything goes silent as they mount their brooms before kicking off into pure chaos. I really want this to be the absolute pinnacle of what Hogwarts Quidditch can be, and I say that because obviously in the next season we will get the World Cup final. The match is obviously complete with all of the Slytherins' dirty tactics, such as fouling the Gryffindor players, Malfoy grabbing the end of Harry's firebolt as he's about to catch the snitch, and Lee Jordan absolutely losing it on commentary.
"You cheating scum!"
And McGonagall losing all composure and shaking her fist at Malfoy. The match finally ends with Harry catching the snitch after Gryffindor are 50 points up, being engulfed by the entire school as he lands, and being handed the Quidditch Cup by a sobbing Oliver Wood. We cut to black to end sequence 1. That whole sequence of events is incredibly heartwarming and happy, and really is a massive payoff for the years of Quidditch we've seen up to this point. Sadly, however, it really is the last happy thing that happens in this episode. Sequence 2 opens up in Divination for that scene that I mentioned earlier. We follow the trio as they enter the Divination classroom, with Hermione already complaining about Divination, saying that Trelawney's a fraud and that she could be using the time to revise more important subjects. objects. And when Professor Trelawney introduces crystal gazing, Hermione goes on to mock her claim that the Fates have informed her about the upcoming exam.
Well, honestly, the Fates have informed her. Who sets the exam? She does. What an amazing prediction.
When Trelawney peers into their orb, she once again predicts the Grim for Harry, at which Hermione finally snaps. Just like in the movie, Trelawney declares Hermione too mundane for divination, and Hermione storms out of the class. The main difference will be Lavender reminding Trelawney that she already predicted that somebody would leave around Easter, which Trelawney smugly accepts as proof of her gift. And I really want this moment to highlight just how stressed Hermione is getting at this point of the year, and once again just provides a little clue as to how she is getting to all of her classes. We then move into the final Hogwarts changing motif of this season, from spring into summer, and during this montage we will see a load of different students studying for their exams. The montage ends in the Great Hall at breakfast at the start of exam week, and we see McGonagall handing out exam timetables, and Ron goes on to notice Hermione's, which has a load of double bookings. Yet another clue. Harry then receives a note from Hagrid saying that Buckbeak's appeal will take place on Friday after the exams, and that an executioner will be attending. To which Ron says,
They can't! I've spent ages reading up stuff for him. They can't just ignore it all.
We then move into a sequence that isn't necessarily a montage, but it is definitely a brief series of scenes of different Hogwarts exams. There's a lot to cover in this episode, so this might only be a couple of minutes per exam, but I do think it's so important to show this side of Hogwarts life, as they are still students and exams are really important. At the end of the day, that's why they're at Hogwarts in the first place. We'd see them struggling through Transfiguration, turning teapots into tortoises. Charms follows, where Harry's over-enthusiastic cheering charm leaves Ron in uncontrollable laughter. Hagrid's Care of Magical Creatures exam is really easy, just keeping flobberworms alive for an hour, giving the trio time to talk to him about Buckbeak's appeal. Potions predictably goes terribly for Harry under Snape's watchful eye. Their final big test is Lupin's Defense Against the Dark Arts obstacle course, which Harry completes brilliantly, Ron struggles through, and Hermione has a complete meltdown. We see her running away from the Boggarts, screaming, saying that she saw McGonagall telling her that she'd failed everything. I want to include this moment for a couple of reasons. Firstly, obviously it's pretty funny, but it also shows that Hermione isn't perfect. Something that the movies definitely did not imply. This short sequence of scenes ends with the trio leaving the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom and heading towards divination, and on their way, they come across Cornelius Fudge. Fudge explains that he's at Hogwarts to act as a witness for the execution of a mad hippogriff, at which Ron says,
You might not have to witness an execution at all. The hippogriff might get off.
But moments later, two officials from the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures appear, one of whom carrying a giant axe. This is obviously the first time that we will see McNair, the executioner, who is actually a recurring character, as he is one of the Death Eaters. And that is something that I want the show to do more of, introduce us to multiple characters who appear in multiple seasons. The trio then head their separate ways, Hermione to Muggle studies, and Harry and Ron to their divination exam. We cut to Harry and Ron waiting outside the divination classroom, and in a sort of time lapse, we see various students ascending and descending the ladder, with Neville telling them,
She says the crystal balls told her that if I tell you, I'll have a horrible accident.
And Lavender Brown saying,
She says I've got all the makings of a true seer. I saw loads of stuff. Well, good luck.
Then it's Ron's turn, and again we see him ascend the ladder, and as Harry is waiting, he looks out of the window and sees Hagrid and Buckbeak in the distance, reminding us of what is to come after the exam. Ron then descends the ladder and says,
Couldn't see a thing, so I made some stuff up. Don't think she was convinced, though.
Before Harry hears his name and he slowly climbs the ladder. During the test, Harry pretends to see a hippogriff in the crystal ball, hoping that it's a good sign for Buckbeak, with Trelawney pushing for darker details and Harry remaining adamant that the hippogriff is fine. And then, as Harry is about to leave, just like in the movie, Professor Trelawney delivers her prediction.
It will happen tonight. The Dark Lord lies alone and friendless, abandoned by his followers. His servant has been chained these 12 years. Tonight, before midnight, the servant will break free and set out to rejoin his master. The Dark Lord will rise again with his servant's aid, greater and more terrible than ever before. Tonight, before midnight, the servant will set out to rejoin his master.
When she comes around, she doesn't remember anything and leaves the classroom, leaving Harry alone, looking confused and worried. We cut to black to end sequence 2. Sequence 3 opens with Harry rushing through the halls of Hogwarts to find Ron and Hermione to tell them about Professor Trelawney's prediction. However, he stops as soon as he sees their faces, and Hermione says that Buckbeak lost the appeal. We see the sun setting over Hogwarts as we cut to Hagrid's hut, and we hear an invisible knock on the door. And honestly, everything that happens from this point is almost exactly what we got in the movie, with just a few minor tweaks here and there. The first difference from the movie is instead of Hagrid finding Scabbers and giving him to Ron, it is Hermione who finds Scabbers when she's making a cup of tea. And the other change will be removing the moment from the movie where Harry gets hit by a rock, causing him to see the execution party. Instead, it's just Hagrid who spots them through the window. He tells them to leave through the back, and they slip away past Buckbeak. And as they hurry up the hill, Scabbers struggles violently, biting and writhing in Ron's hand. Then, from behind them, they hear the swish and thud of an axe. And Hermione says,
"They did it! I don't believe it! They did it!"
We then move into the climax scene of the episode, and once again will be similar to the movie with a few minor differences. As the trio stand under the cloak, they see Crookshanks approaching through the darkness, and suddenly Scabbers bites Ron's finger, breaks free, and bolts, with Crookshanks chasing after him. Ron throws off the invisibility cloak and sprints after them, with Harry and Hermione close behind. They catch up to Ron just as he grabs Scabbers again, and then suddenly, a giant black dog lunges out of the darkness. It seizes Ron and drags him towards the Whomping Willow. And one addition will be the moment where Ron's leg gets caught on a root and we hear a sickening crack as his leg breaks. This is something the movies definitely couldn't have pulled off, but with a darker rating, we can 100% include it here. Now in the movie, we get this wild sequence with Harry and Hermione trying to get past the Whomping Willow, and this will be similar, although I don't think I want to include the moment with them being hoisted up into the air. Instead, as they're dodging the tree's swinging branches, Crookshanks crawls towards the trunk and presses a knot on it. We then follow them as they crawl into the tunnel, following the sounds of Ron's screaming. The journey through the tunnel is incredibly dark and claustrophobic, with the only sounds being Harry and Hermione's panting and Ron's scream of agony in the distance. And eventually, the dark tunnel leads into a room in the Shrieking Shack. They head upstairs where they find Ron injured, clutching Scabbers, and when they ask him where the dog is, Ron says,
"Harry, it's a trap. He's the dog. He's an animagus."
Out of the shadows steps a thin, ghost-like man with hollow eyes and matted hair. Sirius Black. Cue the credits to set up a massive penultimate episode. The episode opens right where we left off, in the Shrieking Shack. We open on complete chaos as the camera throws us straight into the action, with Harry launching himself at Sirius Black, sending them both crashing to the floor. And this fight needs to feel brutal, not a neat choreographed Hollywood fight scene, but a messy and untidy brawl. Sirius eventually seizes Harry by the throat before Ron and Hermione get involved, with Hermione kicking Sirius in the head. This really shows just how loyal Ron and Hermione are to Harry, as the movie didn't show that too much apart from that one line from Hermione.
"If you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too."
Sirius slumps backwards and crawls towards the wall just as Harry scrambles up, picks up his wand, and points it at Sirius Black's chest. And just as he's about to cast, Crookshanks jumps on top of Sirius's heart. It's a small moment, but an effective one, as it completely cuts through the chaos and leaves everybody frozen, and we see Harry struggling with this inner dilemma. I think the moment of silence is absolutely deafening, as yes, Harry hates Sirius and wants to hurt him, but deep down, he's not a killer, and this hesitation really proves this in an unspoken way. Then the door bursts open, and in comes Lupin, who disarms Harry. Lupin lowers his wand and stares at Sirius before the two of them share a fairly cryptic conversation, before Lupin heads over to Sirius, picks him up off the floor, and hugs him. And that's when Hermione completely loses it, saying,
No! Harry, don't trust him. He's been helping Black get into the castle. He wants you dead too. He's a werewolf.
But Lupin shakes his head and says that only the part about him being a werewolf is right, as up until tonight, he thought Sirius was guilty until he saw the map. He explains that he saw something strange on it, something impossible, and that he came down to investigate. And I love this because it directly ties back to everything we've learnt about the map up to this point during this season, and it really gives that whole plotline proper purpose. It's not just another magical object. Lupin walks over and tells the trio and Harry that he helped to write the map, as he is Moony. And it's such a good payoff. As we all know, the movie never revealed this, and we can hold on this moment for a while, allowing the characters and the audience to process this information. Harry just looks at them all, trying to piece together what any of this means, before Lupin asks Ron if he can have a look at Scabbers. Ron protests, saying it's ridiculous, but Sirius steps forward and says,
That's not a rat, an animagus by the name of Peter Pettigrew.
We cut to black, and the title sequence rolls. We open still in the Shrieking Shack, and the mood is tense, but as Lupin begins to talk, his tone softens. The camera holds close to his face as he says,
That's where all of this starts, with my becoming a werewolf.
Now, I don't want this to be a long monologue like it is in the book. Instead, I want the story to unfold through short flashbacks that often cut back to Lupin in the shack, discussing the events of his memories. And that's the key word. It's important that this section feels like a memory, not a monologue. We cut to a small cottage, and we see a small boy sleeping and a shadow moving past the window. We hear a low growl and his mother's scream. But we don't show the bite, just the aftermath. Back in the shack, Lupin continues,
My parents tried everything, but in those days there was no cure.
He goes on to explain the Wolfsbane potion and how Snape has been brewing it all year, and how it lets him keep his mind. And when he says,
Before the Wolfsbane potion was discovered, however, I became a fully fledged monster once a month.
We transition into one of his first transformations. We cut to the Shrieking Shack, but it's clean and newly built, as Lupin explains that Dumbledore allowed him to attend Hogwarts, and they built the Shrieking Shack as a safe place for him to enjoy his transformations. And as he speaks, we see flashes of movement, scratches on the wall, and broken furniture. We also hear screams echoing through the night, and down below in the village, we see an old couple muttering about the spirits in the shack, and this is where the legend of the Shrieking Shack was born. We then cut back to Lupin as we shift tones, and the camera slowly pushes in on his face as he says,
But apart from my transformations, I was happier than I had ever been in my life.
We cut to Hogwarts and see a young Lupin walking down a corridor looking nervous and anxious. Then James and Sirius burst around the corner laughing and confident, with Peter Pettigrew trailing behind them. We montage the early years as Lupin narrates, with the four boys in the common room sneaking down to the kitchens to steal food. And I really want this sequence to feel so warm and nostalgic as a direct opposite to the isolation from before. Lupin says,
"Now my three friends could hardly fail to notice that I disappeared once a month."
and we see James watching him leave the castle with Madame Pomfrey and Sirius frowning. Here I want the tension to build, but not from fear, from love. And Lupin says that eventually they figured out what was going on. He expects to be rejected, but instead Sirius says that they'll find a way. And that line takes us directly into the Animagus sequence, which should be incredibly fun and light-hearted. We go from quiet and emotional to chaotic magical experimentation. It's a 3-year process that's condensed down to about a 1-minute montage of snappy shots, including the steps laid out on Pottermore: holding a mandrake leaf in your mouth for a month, brewing a potion, and drinking it during a lightning storm. Then the big payoff as we see Sirius transform into a giant black dog, James into a stag, Pettigrew into a rat, and finally Remus as a werewolf. As Lupin says,
"They couldn't keep me company as humans, so they kept me company as animals."
this would be my favourite moment, as it would be the first time that we actually see the monster, but it's in such a fun and hopeful way. We'd see the 4 of them running through the moonlit forest as the music swells and the camera soars over the trees. Now I know that Harry doesn't actually find out what animal James becomes at this point in the book, and I don't think he needs to find out at this point either. But I think it's so important for the audience to see all of the animals together, as it's something that the Potter fans have been dying to see for so long. We then cut to the friends scribbling on a piece of parchment as Lupin says,
"And that's how we came to write the Marauders' map."
and we see the names appear in glowing ink: Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs. And that's our emotional peak. The friendship, the freedom, and the bond that ties together this entire story. But then the tone shifts again as we move back to the Shrieking Shack, and Hermione says that it's still incredibly dangerous, and Lupin says,
"A thought that still haunts me."
Then we reach the Snape section of the story, and I want this told like a confession. Lupin can barely look at them as he says what Sirius did, trying to trick Snape into the Whomping Willow, how Snape almost died, and how James had to save him. We intercut flashes again, such as Snape skulking around after the 4 of them, Sirius whispering, James running, and a glimpse of the werewolf's glowing eyes in the dark. We cut back to the shack as Harry says,
"So that's why Snape doesn't like you, because he thought you were in on the joke."
At which Snape throws off the invisibility cloak, revealing himself to be standing in the doorway as he says,
"That's right."
before we cut to black to end sequence 2. Once again, I really want this whole sequence to just be an absolutely massive payoff to all of the die-hard Potter fans, as it's something that's been asked for decades. And it could also set up the potential for a Marauders spin-off story, as we now have a fully cast and reenacted backstory. Sequence 3 opens in the middle of pure tension, with Snape standing in the middle of it all. And with a flick of his wand, he conjures ropes that bind themselves around Lupin. And what I think is really important here is that it should all feel incredibly human. Essentially, it's a collision of years of hatred and misunderstanding all erupting at once. Snape begins triumphant as he tells Sirius and Lupin that they'll both be given to the Dementors, but he gets slowly more and more deranged as each person tries to correct him, and it all erupts when Harry tries to block his way out of the shack, and Snape shouts,
"Get out of the way, Potter!"
Then suddenly everything explodes as a blast of magic from 3 sides crashes into Snape, sending him shooting back into the wall. The trio all tried to disarm him at the same time, once again showing their loyalty. And this is again where the tone shifts. Sirius steps forward, finally taking control of the room as Harry tells him to explain. And once again, instead of relying on pure dialogue, we cut to fragmented flashbacks tying together everything that we thought we knew up to this point. We start seeing moments from earlier in the season, during that scene in the Three Broomsticks with the teachers and Fudge, but now with the context changed, they take on an entirely different meaning. The camera revisits certain scenes that we've seen before. We see the night of the explosion, and Sirius laughing as Pettigrew vanishes, all shown in quick flashes as the truth is finally breaking. It's the same footage from earlier in the season, the same memories, but now the audience fully understands the betrayal behind it. We would also see some new shots, however, such as Pettigrew's missing finger, the street in ruins, and Sirius's expression as he gets arrested. And before this, we will also see Sirius arriving at the house, which has now been destroyed, meeting Hagrid there and giving him his motorcycle. This is just a really nice Easter egg that is in the books from the very beginning, and it would be really cool to see this brought to life. All of the pieces that we've already seen, plus the new footage, all click into place, and finally the mystery comes together, and Harry and the audience understand. We then move back to the shack, and the rest of the scene from here will be very similar to the movie, with Sirius and Lupin seizing Scabbers, transforming him back into Pettigrew, and the whole conversation with him. There will of course be some additions, such as Pettigrew pleading even more than he did in the movie, still feigning innocence, and Sirius explaining how he escaped from Azkaban without using dark magic, by transforming into a dog after he saw the newspaper that Fudge gave him. Again, like in the movie, Harry eventually believes Sirius, but tells Sirius and Lupin to not kill Peter, as they will give him to the Dementors. And then we move into the climax of this episode. Ron and Lupin bind Pettigrew in chains to both of them, and Sirius levitates Snape to float beside them. Crookshanks leaps down and starts to lead the group through the passage to the Whomping Willow. The camera follows them through the tunnel, once again tight and claustrophobic, but this time more hopeful, as Sirius and Harry discuss the potential for Harry going to live with him. And I especially want to include how Sirius is quite obviously allowing Snape's head to bump against the ceiling here. Even with Snape unconscious, their hatred is just a pure constant. Eventually, we see the party emerge out of the Whomping Willow into the grounds, and then Lupin stops. At first, no one notices. He's quiet, his head is bowed, and his breathing is uneven. It's kind of like in a horror movie when somebody is acting oddly but no one realizes what is happening. Then the camera catches it. A tremor in his hand, a faint glow of sweat on his brow, and a low, guttural sound coming from him. This is the moment the audience realizes something bad is happening before any of the characters do. And I want it to be really subtle. No big CGI spectacle yet, just a suggestion. A quick shot of his eyes changing, the sound of bones stretching, and clothes tearing. Crookshanks stops dead as Pettigrew flinches, and Sirius turns around, knowing what's about to happen. The tension just builds and builds until it becomes almost unbearable. We cut to black, and after a moment of silence, cue the credits. The episode opens in the middle of Lupin's horrifying transformation, and with the older age rating of TV-14 that I've mentioned before, I do really want this to be pretty shocking. Lupin's change should also be incredibly raw and painful, which really just highlights how big a burden this is on him and how much he's been hiding from everybody all year. As he eventually completes his transformation, the manacle binding Ron and Pettigrew to him snaps. Sirius reacts immediately and transforms into Padfoot, and I really want the speed to be highlighted here as it shows the experience that Sirius has at dealing with Lupin's condition. He doesn't hesitate or consider the risk to himself, he just goes straight in, showing again just how deep their friendship really is. And the fight between Lupin and Sirius needs to be very messy and uneven, as really I want the audience to see just how tragic this situation situation is, with these two best friends being forced into this fight. And the lack of clean movement really supports the idea that this really is a disaster, not just an action scene. While the fight absorbs everybody, Pettigrew seizes his chance, grabs the wand off the floor, pushes Ron and Crookshanks aside, and vanishes. Once Pettigrew escapes, Sirius and Lupin sprint off towards the forest and the lake, leaving the scene to breathe for a couple of seconds. The sound mix drops into a ringing silence, and we see Snape levitating in the air, Ron is down, and the trio look helplessly at the space around them. A distant yelping is the cue that breaks the silence, and the camera tracks Harry as he sprints off towards the lake with Hermione in tow. As they reach the lake shore, the cold hits with a visual cue. The lighting goes into a kind of cold blue, and the breath becomes visible in the air. The Dementors appear as a slow, silent wave, first being blurred in the background before they start filling up the frame, suggesting that everything is closing in. Harry then tries to conjure a Patronus, but we see that these attempts are incredibly frail and desperate, and this is going to massively contrast what we see later in the episode. And I want the editing done in a certain way that really highlights this, so when he's performing the Patronus, the wand light flickers, making his face look younger and more vulnerable. With each attempt, the music thins out, and the screaming in Harry's head starts to fade in, including the rattling sound of the Dementor's breath. When Hermione collapses, I want the camera to dip as well, making Harry look completely isolated at this point, surrounded by this crowd of hooded figures. And then we see one Dementor approaching Harry, lowering his hood as the camera pushes in. Then, across the lake, a burst of bright white light illuminates everything, and I really want the Patronus to be completely shifting the environment. Harry can't quite tell what it is, but he can make out that it's some form of animal running across the lake, captured in a long, wide shot. The Dementors scatter, and we see Harry watching the animal running back to a figure across the shore, and when it holds up a hand, we linger on this shot for a beat, allowing the audience to try and question what it is they're seeing. Harry collapses, the sound dampens, and the sequence ends with a slow pullback shot of Harry, Hermione, and Sirius lying unconscious on the lake edge. We cut to black, and the title sequence rolls. After the title sequence, we open with Harry slowly regaining consciousness. He squints as he notices that everything's slightly blurred, and when he looks around, he sees Madame Pomfrey at the end of the ward tending to Ron, and when he looks to his other side, he sees Hermione lying there looking at him with a finger to her lips. The faint murmurs from Fudge and Snape filter in from the corridor, with Fudge thanking Snape for everything he did, and Snape informing him about everything that happened, although literally all of it is wrong. Harry's eyes widen as he tries to focus, but at that point, Madame Pomfrey approaches him carrying a massive mountain of chocolate, breaks off a bit, and shoves it in Harry's mouth. Even in these tense moments, there is still room for the occasional comedic one. Harry insists that he needs to go and see Dumbledore, but at that moment, Fudge and Snape enter the room. Harry and Hermione try to explain, shouting over each other, and it's deliberately chaotic as the tension just builds. The camera lingers on Harry and Hermione's shocked faces as Dumbledore speaks to Snape and Fudge and asks them to leave the room, leaving him alone with them. His tone is quiet and precise as he explains that Sirius is now imprisoned in Flitwick's classroom, and that time is their only ally as he has a fairly cryptic conversation with Hermione.
Miss Granger, you know the law. You know what is at stake. You must not be seen.
Before he leaves the room, Hermione then produces the time turner, and the tiny hourglass catches glints of light as she explains what it is. The camera lingers on Harry's bewildered face whilst the hourglass is turned 3 times. The world twists, dissolving into a blur of colour and movement, and it is similar to the standard time travel trope. However, this time I want to see it more grounded from Harry's point of view. Sound here is also crucial, as we hear a kind of layered whooshing sound and a ticking that gets more and more intense as the hourglass rotates. When they emerge into the deserted entrance hall, Harry and Hermione head into a broom cupboard, and this is when Hermione explains what the time turner is. And as she does so, we'll see flashes from earlier in the season, which really connects the dots around Hermione's strange behaviour. They go on to plan their next moves with precise attention to sightlines, Hagrid's hut, and the Whomping Willow. We follow them as they navigate past the greenhouses to the forest edge, and we'll alternate the camera shots between their anxious faces and Buckbeak tethered to a post. And the next few scenes will actually be very similar to what we got in the movie. The committee arrives and we hear Fudge reading the execution decree as the camera tightens on Buckbeak's eyes. We then watch Harry and Hermione move silently towards Buckbeak, pulling his rope and encouraging him to move forward, and just like in the movie, it will be incredibly tense. And when Buckbeak moves towards the forest, there's definitely a sense of relief, but the danger isn't over. Then, like in the movie, the Whomping Willow sequence is shown from Harry and Hermione's perspective, including Snape and Lupin's arrival. We also get the moment where Harry wants to go and collect the cloak before Snape arrives, but Hermione stops him just in time before we see Hagrid making his way up to the castle, drunk and singing. Hermione says,
"See what would have happened? We've got to keep out of sight."
Again, like in the movie, Harry and Hermione have a conversation about who produced the Patronus, with Harry saying that he thinks it was his dad, and then we see the party emerge from the Whomping Willow. The first big change that we'll have seen for a while is when Harry and Hermione run away from the forest with Buckbeak, as they realise Lupin will head towards them, and instead they head to Hagrid's hut. In the hut, Harry's attention shifts to what's going to happen at the lake, and after he says,
"I'm not going to try and interfere, but if we don't see what's going on, how are we going to know when it's time to rescue Sirius?"
he heads to the lake to observe what is happening. He watches the Dementors surrounding Harry, Hermione and Sirius, and he sees his own Patronus flickering in the distance. Then Harry understands. He bursts forward and produces his own fully fledged Patronus. Unlike in the movie, the stag bursts fully into view, driving the Dementors back. The camera follows it, galloping across the lake, glinting in the moonlight, before it returns to Harry, bows, and vanishes. As I mentioned in the previous episode, the movie completely left out the Marauder's backstory, and that left this Patronus scene lacking a little bit for me in this movie. We didn't get a proper look at the stag, and when we did catch a glimpse of it, it just didn't really make sense in the context of the film. The sequence ends with Harry standing in shock about what he just did. We cut to black to end sequence 2. Sequence 3 begins with Harry still standing by the lake with his arm outstretched as the Patronus glow fades, and then suddenly there's a burst of movement as Hermione appears, pulling Buckbeak into frame. And as Harry explains what he's just done, I really want the camera to focus on Hermione's expressions here, as her reaction would sell the insanity of what just happened far more than Harry's explanation. We then shift to Snape arriving at the lake's edge, and in a wide shot we'll see him conjure up the stretchers that rise into frame. Hermione then checks her watch, which allows us to pick up this clock-ticking theme again. Hermione says,
"We've got about 45 minutes until Dumbledore locks the door to the hospital wing. We've got to rescue Sirius and get back into the ward before anybody realises we're missing."
Before we see McNair, the executioner, crossing the grounds, and under the moonlight we'll catch a glimpse of his axe, which really highlights what is still to come without it being too obvious. From there we move into the Buckbeak and Sirius escape sequence, and just like in the movie, it will be incredibly cinematic. Harry climbs up first before Hermione clambers on terrified, and Buckbeak ascends into the air. It gives us one of the few chances in this finale to really take a breath as we see grand wide shots of the hippogriffs soaring over the grounds and the castle. Eventually they arrive at the window where Sirius is being kept, and once he clambers out onto Buckbeak, they fly off as the pace picks up again to the West Tower. As they arrive, Harry and Hermione slide off and urge Sirius to go. And this final exchange between them will be pretty small. The moment in the movie where Harry and Sirius share a conversation is absolutely iconic and could be some of the best acting in the entire series, and I really don't want the show to copy that or kind of take anything away from it. Here it will be much more similar to the book, with Sirius stammering his thanks whilst Harry and Hermione keep cutting him off, telling him to go, before Sirius says,
"We'll see each other again. You are, truly, your father's son, Harry."
And he soars off into the night. We then follow Harry and Hermione as they rush towards the hospital wing, and I almost want this to feel like a bit of a heist sequence with loads of low angles, running around corners, flickering torches, as they try to make it back unseen. On their way, they overhear Fudge and Snape, and we see Harry tensing up as they hear Snape's arrogance and Fudge's self-satisfaction. They also have to avoid Peeves, which will just add to the chaotic Hogwarts energy, but I would cut it quickly, almost like a jump scare interruption. It's just enough to add variety to the escape. By the time Harry and Hermione reach the corridor leading towards the hospital wing, the tension is completely peaking as Hermione keeps checking her watch, keeping the pressure on the viewer. Then Dumbledore appears outside the door, and this acts like a tonal release, slowing everything down and lifting the weight of the pressure. Dumbledore lets them inside, and after a few moments of silence, chaos erupts as Snape and Fudge burst into the hospital wing. Snape shouts accusations and Fudge spirals whilst Dumbledore dismantles everything, and I would like the camera to be very locked off here, almost completely contrasting Snape's energy. The more unhinged he gets, the calmer the frame becomes, allowing him to really unravel whilst not becoming too chaotic. The moment reaches its climax as Dumbledore asks Madame Pomfrey if Harry and Hermione ever left their beds, at which she says,
"Of course not. I've been with them ever since you left."
Leading to Snape storming out with Dumbledore and Fudge close behind. And then Ron comes around in bed, and it gives us that final little character moment that we need. He's confused and panicking as he's trying to work out what's happened, and I especially love the moment with Harry handing it off to Hermione saying,
"You explain."
because it's such a Harry way to end such a chaotic night. We cut to black to end Sequence 3. Sequence 4 is one that ties everything else from this season in a really nice way, much more fitting to the story, as opposed to that freeze frame. The sequence opens with Harry going to find Professor Lupin in his office, and on his way the corridors are completely quiet and empty, and the only sound is the echo of Harry's footsteps. Like in the movie, Lupin is already packing, and I'd like to keep the camera handheld at this moment to keep this all incredibly grounded and human. Harry stands by the desk as Lupin folds away the last of his things, and he goes on to explain that he's resigned as Snape let slip his condition at breakfast. When Dumbledore arrives at the doorway, Lupin leaves with a brief word to the pair of them, and Dumbledore steps inside for a conversation with Harry that was left out of the movie. They talk about what happened at the lake and Professor Trelawney's prediction, at which Dumbledore says,
"Who'd have thought it? That brings her total of real predictions up to 2. I should offer her a pay rise."
They also discuss Pettigrew and his escape, which allows the audience to understand the long-term consequences of everything that happened, especially with Pettigrew now being indebted to Harry, as this will be so crucial in the future. Then the conversation moves on to James, and we get the confirmation that Harry's Patronus is a stag due to his father, as Dumbledore says,
"So you did see your father last night, Harry? You found him inside yourself."
And with that final emotional beat, we transition into the final sequence, which is the train journey. Hermione reveals she's dropped Muggle studies, and then the conversation shifts to the Quidditch World Cup, setting up next season. Then Sirius's letter arrives with a tiny owl. Obviously he's not named at this point, but it is going to be nice to finally see Pigwidgeon. Harry opens the letter and reads that Sirius and Buckbeak are now in hiding. He also reads,
It was I who sent you the firebolt.
Which is a really nice way to tie up one of the ongoing mysteries of this season. He then goes on to pull out the Hogsmeade permission slip from Sirius, and the camera pushes in on Harry's face, underlining this incredibly emotional moment. The episode winds down as we follow Harry off the train and into King's Cross Station, where we see the Dursleys standing awkwardly in the middle of all the chaos. When Uncle Vernon asks Harry about the letter he's holding, Harry says,
"It's a letter from my godfather. He was my mum and dad's best friend. He's a convicted murderer, but he's broken out of wizard prison, and he's on the run."
Leaving Uncle Vernon stunned. And the last beat works if we hold on Harry's expression for a moment. He's not smug or triumphant, he's just satisfied. We cut to black to end the episode. But as always, we need to end the season on a teaser for season 4. A dark forest fades in and a title card appears saying Albania. We cut to a moonlit forest floor. A single rat zooms through the undergrowth as we see other rats appearing and squeaking at it before disappearing. The forest grows darker and darker as he pushes deeper, and the sound starts to fade out, replaced by a low hissing sound. The rat slips into a hollow beneath a twisted tree, and we linger on total blackness for a moment. Then we hear a thin whisper say, "Wormtail," and the credits roll. Once again though, remember to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, like the video and hit the notification bell, as I said, there will still be tons more Harry Potter news, theories and breakdowns coming out very soon.